Battle of the Bulge, a deep historical narrative. In the winter of 1944, as Europe seemed to teeter on the brink of liberation, the illusion of imminent Allied victory concealed a dangerous miscalculation. Beneath the surface of apparent German collapse, a final violent convulsion was taking shape, one that would erupt in the dense forests of the Ardennes and become known as the Battle of the Bulge. To understand how such an audacious offensive could materialize so late in the war, one must begin not in December 1944, but years earlier, within the ideological, economic, and military framework of Nazi Germany itself. Deep historical background. By late 1944, the Third Reich was a state under immense strain, yet still dangerously capable. The grand strategic vision of Adolf Hitler had always been rooted in rapid, decisive warfare, blitzkrieg, designed to avoid prolonged attrition. Early successes in Poland, France, and the Low Countries reinforced this doctrine. However, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, followed by catastrophic defeats such as Battle of Stalingrad, marked the beginning of a slow but irreversible erosion of German military capacity. By 1944, Germany faced a multi-front war of attrition it could not sustain indefinitely. In the east, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly after Operation Bagration. In the west, the Allies had successfully landed in Normandy during D-Day in June 1944 and were pushing toward Germany's borders. Economically, Germany was suffocating. Allied strategic bombing campaigns had crippled industrial production and transportation networks. Fuel shortages were critical. Synthetic fuel plants, vital for sustaining mechanized warfare, were prime targets and increasingly ineffective. Despite this, German industry, under Albert Speer, maintained a surprising level of output, reflecting both administrative efficiency and the brutal exploitation of forced labor. Psychologically, the German leadership was trapped between realism and delusion. Many senior commanders recognized the war was unwinnable in conventional terms. Yet Hitler, increasingly isolated and distrustful, clung to the belief that a single decisive blow could fracture Allied unity and force a negotiated peace. Escalation and build-up of tensions. By autumn 1944, the Western Front had stabilized along a broad line stretching from the North Sea to Switzerland. Allied forces under Dwight D. Eisenhower faced logistical constraints of their own. Rapid advances after Normandy had stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Fuel shortages, ironically mirrored on both sides, slowed momentum. The failure of Operation Market Garden in September 1944, a bold but flawed attempt to secure a crossing over the Rhine, further delayed Allied progress. This created a temporary operational pause, which the Germans recognized as an opportunity. The Ardennes region, spanning parts of Belgium and Luxembourg, was considered a quiet sector. Dense forests, rugged terrain, and poor weather made it unsuitable for large-scale offensives, at least in Allied estimation. This assumption would prove catastrophic. German forces in the area were under strength and often composed of inexperienced troops or units recovering from earlier defeats. To the Allies, it was a secondary front. To Hitler, it was the perfect staging ground for a surprise attack. Strategic planning and decision-making. In September 1944, Hitler conceived an ambitious plan. A massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes aimed at splitting Allied forces, capturing the port of Antwerp, and encircling several armies. The operation was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, later renamed Herbstnebel, Autumn Mist. The plan bore striking similarities to the 1940 campaign that had defeated France. It relied on speed, surprise, and concentrated armored thrusts. However, the strategic context was radically different. Germany no longer possessed overwhelming superiority in armor, air power, or logistics. The offensive would depend on absolute secrecy, rapid breakthroughs, capturing Allied fuel supplies to sustain the advance. Senior German commanders, including Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model, expressed skepticism. They viewed the plan as overly ambitious, given available resources. Both proposed more limited offensives designed to disrupt rather than decisively defeat Allied forces. Hitler rejected these alternatives. His reasoning was both strategic and psychological. He believed the Western Allies, particularly the British and Americans, lacked the political will for prolonged high casualties. A dramatic defeat, he argued, might fracture the alliance, especially between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. The plan assigned key roles to elite armored units, including those commanded by Joachim Peiper, tasked with spearheading deep penetrations. Special operations units, under Otto Skorzeny, would infiltrate Allied lines in captured uniforms, spreading confusion and disrupting communications. Logistically, the operation was precarious from the outset. Fuel shortages meant the offensive depended on capturing Allied depots intact. Weather forecasts predicted heavy cloud cover, which would neutralize Allied air superiority, a critical factor in the plan's timing. Execution begins. December 16, 1944. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the offensive began. At 5:30 a.m., over 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire along an 80-mile front. The bombardment shattered the quiet of the Ardennes, targeting American positions held primarily by inexperienced or exhausted units. The initial assault achieved near-total surprise. American forces, including elements of the 106th Infantry Division, were quickly overwhelmed in some sectors. Communications broke down. Units were isolated. Confusion spread rapidly, exacerbated by the unfamiliar terrain and winter conditions. German infantry and armored units advanced through the forest, exploiting weak points and bypassing strongholds. Their objective was not to engage in prolonged combat, but to push forward as rapidly as possible. At the operational level, 3 German armies advanced westward: the 6th SS Panzer Army in the north, the 5th Panzer Army in the center, the 7th Army in the south. The central thrust achieved the greatest success initially, creating a deep penetration in Allied lines. This bulge in the front line would give the battle its name. However, even in these early stages, structural problems began to emerge. Road congestion was severe. The Ardennes' limited infrastructure forced German units into narrow corridors, creating bottlenecks that slowed the advance. Fuel consumption exceeded expectations. Resistance, though initially disorganized, began to stiffen. At the tactical level, small American units played a disproportionate role in delaying the German advance. Isolated platoons and companies held key road junctions, often fighting to the last man. These delays, measured in hours, would prove strategically decisive. Micro-perspective. The human experience. For the soldiers on both sides, the battle was defined by cold, confusion, and sudden violence. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Snow and fog limited visibility. Frostbite became as dangerous as enemy fire. Many American troops, caught off guard, lacked adequate winter clothing. German soldiers, though better prepared for the offensive, faced exhaustion from forced marches and constant pressure to maintain momentum. The promise of a decisive victory contrasted sharply with the grim reality on the ground. One of the most infamous incidents occurred near Malmedy, where troops under Joachim Peiper executed American prisoners of war. The Malmedy massacre became a symbol of the brutality of the campaign and hardened Allied resolve. This is only the opening phase of the Battle of the Bulge. The situation is about to escalate dramatically, with critical turning points including the Siege of Bastogne, the Allied response, and the eventual collapse of the German offensive. Battle of the Bulge, a deep historical narrative. As the German offensive surged westward in the opening days following December 16, 1944, the illusion of Allied control over the Western Front dissolved into a crisis of command, logistics, and survival. What had begun as a localized breakthrough was rapidly evolving into a strategic emergency. The front line, once coherent, had warped into a jagged, swelling protrusion. The bulge was no longer a metaphor. It was a widening rupture in the Allied defensive system. Execution continues. Expansion, friction, and resistance. Despite early gains, the German advance began to encounter a reality far harsher than the assumptions embedded in its planning. The offensive depended on speed. Speed required coordination, fuel, and open roads. None of these conditions held consistently. The Ardennes, far from being a silent corridor for armored maneuver, became a constricted maze. Narrow, icy roads funneled entire divisions into predictable routes. Traffic jams extended for miles. Vehicles stalled, broke down, or ran out of fuel. Commanders lost contact with forward elements. The tempo, critical to the success of the operation, began to falter. Yet, at key points, the German advance remained dangerously effective. In the northern sector, the 6th SS Panzer Army, including elite Waffen-SS units, attempted to break through toward Liège. However, stiffening American resistance, combined with difficult terrain, slowed their progress significantly. The anticipated rapid breakthrough failed to materialize. In contrast, the Central Axis, under the 5th Panzer Army, achieved deeper penetration. German armored columns advanced toward the Meuse River, a critical geographic objective. If crossed, it would open the path toward Antwerp. But here, too, time became the decisive variable. Bastogne, the strategic nerve center. At the heart of the unfolding battle lay the small Belgian town of Bastogne, a seemingly unremarkable location that would become one of the most critical nodes in the entire campaign. Bastogne was not important for its size or industry. Its value lay in its roads. 7 major routes converged there, making it a logistical hub essential for any large-scale movement through the Ardennes. German planners had identified Bastogne as a key objective. However, in the chaos of the initial advance, capturing it quickly proved more difficult than anticipated. Recognizing its importance, Allied command rushed reinforcements to the area. Among them were elements of the 101st Airborne Division, a unit already distinguished by its role in D-Day. These troops, many of whom had only recently recovered from earlier operations, were hastily redeployed, often without full equipment. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. The siege had begun. Micro-perspective. Bastogne, under siege. Inside Bastogne, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The encircled American forces faced severe shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Winter conditions intensified the hardship. Snow blanketed the ground. Temperatures plummeted. Frostbite cases increased daily. Artillery bombardments were relentless. German forces sought to break the defenders through constant pressure. Civilians, trapped in the town, shared the suffering, huddling in basements, enduring shelling and deprivation. Command of the American forces fell to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. When German forces demanded surrender, his response, "Nuts," became legendary. It was more than defiance. It was psychological warfare. The refusal signaled to both sides that Bastogne would not fall easily. Allied command response, stabilizing the front. At the strategic level, the Allied response began to coalesce under pressure. General Dwight D. Eisenhower faced one of the most critical decisions of his command. The German offensive had split Allied lines, creating confusion and threatening to disrupt coordination between American and British forces. Eisenhower's response was decisive. Stabilize the shoulders of the Bulge, prevent further German expansion, and prepare a counteroffensive. A key component of this response was the rapid redeployment of forces. Among them was the Third Army, commanded by George S. Patton. At the time, Patton's forces were engaged elsewhere. Redirecting an entire army in the middle of winter, under combat conditions, was a logistical feat of extraordinary complexity. Yet Patton executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. Within days, the Third Army pivoted northward, moving through difficult terrain and weather with the objective of relieving Bastogne. German operational strain, the offensive slows. As the days passed, the structural weaknesses of the German plan became increasingly apparent. Fuel shortages intensified. Units that had advanced rapidly now found themselves immobilized. Attempts to capture Allied fuel depots yielded inconsistent results. In many cases, supplies had been destroyed or evacuated. Weather, initially favorable, began to shift. The heavy cloud cover that had grounded Allied aircraft started to break. As skies cleared, Allied air superiority reasserted itself with devastating effect. Fighter bombers targeted German columns, supply lines, and staging areas. The narrow roads of the Ardennes became killing zones. Coordination between German units deteriorated. The ambitious objective of reaching the Meuse River and beyond slipped further out of reach. Even elite units, such as those under Joachim Peiper, found themselves isolated, low on fuel, and increasingly vulnerable. Peiper's advance, once a spearhead of the offensive, ultimately stalled and was forced to withdraw. The turning point. Relief of Bastogne. On December 26, 1944, after days of intense fighting and mounting desperation, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was not entirely lifted immediately, but the encirclement had been broken. This moment marked a critical turning point in the battle. The German offensive had lost its momentum. What had begun as a bold attempt to fracture Allied forces was now transforming into a struggle for survival. German units, extended and undersupplied, faced a growing counteroffensive from multiple directions. Immediate consequences: collapse in motion. As December turned into January, the German position deteriorated rapidly. Allied forces launched coordinated counterattacks from the north and south, compressing the Bulge. The salient that had once represented German advance now became a liability, exposing their forces to encirclement. Casualties mounted on both sides. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The psychological toll was equally profound. For many American troops, the battle represented their first experience of large-scale, high-intensity combat under extreme conditions. German forces, meanwhile, faced the collapse of their final major offensive in the West. The failure carried implications beyond the battlefield. Political and military response. The failure of the offensive weakened Germany's strategic position irreversibly. Within the German high command, confidence eroded further. The gap between Hitler's expectations and operational reality became impossible to ignore. Yet, even in failure, Hitler refused to abandon his broader vision of total resistance. On the Allied side, the battle reinforced both caution and confidence. Caution, because it demonstrated that Germany retained the capacity for large-scale offensive action. Confidence, because the offensive had been contained and ultimately reversed. The cooperation between Allied forces, including American and British units, was tested under extreme conditions. Despite initial tensions, coordination improved as the battle progressed. The Battle of the Bulge is now entering its final phase. The full Allied counteroffensive, the destruction of German capacity in the West, and the long-term consequences that would shape the end of World War II. Continue to Part 3 for the conclusion, including strategic analysis, long-term impact, and historical legacy. Battle of the Bulge, a deep historical narrative. By the final days of December 1944, the trajectory of the Battle of the Bulge had irreversibly shifted. What had begun as a bold, high-risk German counteroffensive, conceived to fracture the Allied coalition and alter the strategic balance in Western Europe, was now collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The German advance had culminated, stalled, and begun to recede. The initiative, once seized through surprise and aggression, had passed decisively into Allied hands. Medium and long-term consequences. The final unraveling. As January 1945 unfolded, Allied forces moved methodically to eliminate the Bulge. From the north, British and American units pressed southward. From the south, forces under George S. Patton drove north. The objective was not merely to push the Germans back, but to destroy their capacity to resist effectively in the west. The German retreat was neither orderly nor uniform. In some sectors, units disengaged with discipline. In others, the withdrawal devolved into chaos. Equipment was abandoned due to fuel shortages. Vehicles were destroyed to prevent capture. Supply lines, already fragile, collapsed entirely under sustained Allied air attacks. By late January, the front lines had largely returned to their pre-offensive positions. But the strategic landscape had changed profoundly. Coordination between German units deteriorated. The ambitious objective of reaching the Meuse River and beyond slipped further out of reach. Even elite units, such as those under Joachim Peiper, found themselves isolated, low on fuel, and increasingly vulnerable. Peiper's advance, once a spearhead of the offensive, ultimately stalled and was forced to withdraw. The turning point. Relief of Bastogne. On December 26, 1944, after days of intense fighting and mounting desperation, elements of Patton's Third Army broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was not entirely lifted immediately, but the encirclement had been broken. This moment marked a critical turning point in the battle. The German offensive had lost its momentum. What had begun as a bold attempt to fracture Allied forces was now transforming into a struggle for survival. German units, extended and undersupplied, faced a growing counteroffensive from multiple directions. Immediate consequences: collapse in motion. As December turned into January, the German position deteriorated rapidly. Allied forces launched coordinated counterattacks from the north and south, compressing the Bulge. The salient that had once represented German advance now became a liability, exposing their forces to encirclement. Casualties mounted on both sides. The human cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. The psychological toll was equally profound. For many American troops, the battle represented their first experience of large-scale, high-intensity combat under extreme conditions. German forces, meanwhile, faced the collapse of their final major offensive in the West. The failure carried implications beyond the battlefield. Political and military response. The failure of the offensive weakened Germany's strategic position irreversibly. Within the German high command, confidence eroded further. The gap between Hitler's expectations and operational reality became impossible to ignore. Yet, even in failure, Hitler refused to abandon his broader vision of total resistance. On the Allied side, the battle reinforced both caution and confidence. Caution, because it demonstrated that Germany retained the capacity for large-scale offensive action. Confidence, because the offensive had been contained and ultimately reversed. The cooperation between Allied forces, including American and British units, was tested under extreme conditions. Despite initial tensions, coordination improved as the battle progressed. The Battle of the Bulge is now entering its final phase. The full Allied counteroffensive, the destruction of German capacity in the West, and the long-term consequences that would shape the end of World War II. Continue to Part 3 for the conclusion, including strategic analysis, long-term impact, and historical legacy. Battle of the Bulge, a deep historical narrative. By the final days of December 1944, the trajectory of the Battle of the Bulge had irreversibly shifted. What had begun as a bold, high-risk German counteroffensive, conceived to fracture the Allied coalition and alter the strategic balance in Western Europe, was now collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The German advance had culminated, stalled, and begun to recede. The initiative, once seized through surprise and aggression, had passed decisively into Allied hands. Medium and long-term consequences. The final unraveling. As January 1945 unfolded, Allied forces moved methodically to eliminate the Bulge. From the north, British and American units pressed southward. From the south, forces under George S. Patton drove north. The objective was not merely to push the Germans back, but to destroy their capacity to resist effectively in the west. The German retreat was neither orderly nor uniform. In some sectors, units disengaged with discipline. In others, the withdrawal devolved into chaos. Equipment was abandoned due to fuel shortages. Vehicles were destroyed to prevent capture. Supply lines, already fragile, collapsed entirely under sustained Allied air attacks. By late January, the front lines had largely returned to their pre-offensive positions. But the strategic landscape had changed profoundly. Germany had expended its last significant operational reserve in the west. The armored divisions committed to the offensive, many of them among the Reich's most experienced and best-equipped formations, had been severely degraded. Tanks, artillery, and trained personnel lost in the Ardennes could not be replaced at this stage of the war. Simultaneously, the Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of Soviet offensives. In January 1945, the Red Army launched the Vistula-Oder offensive, advancing rapidly toward Germany itself. The failure in the Ardennes meant that Germany no longer had the resources to stabilize either front. The war had entered its terminal phase. Economic and structural exhaustion. From an economic standpoint, the offensive was catastrophic for Germany. Fuel, already critically scarce, had been consumed in massive quantities during the operation. The plan's reliance on capturing Allied fuel depots had proven unrealistic. Without fuel, Germany's mechanized forces, the backbone of its operational doctrine, were effectively neutralized. Industrial output, though still functioning under the direction of Albert Speer, could not compensate for losses at this scale. Allied bombing campaigns continued to degrade production capacity, infrastructure, and transportation networks. Rail systems were disrupted, supply chains fragmented. The Ardennes offensive, rather than restoring strategic balance, accelerated systemic collapse. Strategic analysis. Why the offensive failed. At its core, the failure of the German offensive can be understood as the result of a fundamental misalignment between ambition and capability. The plan conceived by Adolf Hitler was strategically bold but operationally unsound, given the realities of late 1944. Several critical factors determined the outcome. First, the overextension of objectives. The goal of reaching Antwerp required rapid, sustained advances over extended distances. This demanded logistical support that Germany no longer possessed. The plan assumed ideal conditions: speed, surprise, and minimal resistance, none of which could be guaranteed. Second, logistical fragility. Fuel shortages were not a secondary concern, they were existential. The offensive depended on capturing enemy supplies, introducing a level of uncertainty incompatible with operational reliability. Once momentum slowed, the entire system began to fail. Third, terrain and infrastructure constraints. The Ardennes, chosen for its perceived vulnerability, imposed severe limitations on maneuver. Narrow roads created bottlenecks. Traffic congestion disrupted coordination. Units could not deploy or redeploy with the flexibility required for dynamic operations. Fourth, Allied resilience and adaptability. Despite initial surprise, Allied forces responded with increasing effectiveness. Small unit resistance delayed German advances at critical points. Command structures adapted quickly. The rapid redeployment of forces, particularly under Dwight D. Eisenhower, stabilized the front. Fifth, the restoration of Allied air superiority. Weather had initially shielded German forces. Once skies cleared, Allied aircraft inflicted disproportionate damage on exposed columns and supply lines. This factor alone significantly accelerated the collapse of the offensive. Sixth, internal dissent within German command. Senior commanders such as Gerd von Rundstedt and Walter Model had expressed doubts about the plan's feasibility. Their preference for more limited operations reflected a more realistic assessment of German capabilities. Hitler's insistence on maximal objectives overrode these concerns. In aggregate, the offensive was not merely defeated, it was structurally doomed. Micro-perspective. The human aftermath. For the soldiers who survived, the end of the battle brought not triumph, but exhaustion. American troops, many of whom had entered the Ardennes expecting a quiet sector, emerged hardened by one of the most intense engagements of the war. The psychological shock of the initial German breakthrough left a lasting imprint. Yet the successful defense and eventual counterattack reinforced confidence in their capacity to withstand and overcome. German soldiers, by contrast, faced a more complex reality. Many had participated in what they believed to be a decisive, even redemptive operation. The failure of the offensive and the heavy losses it incurred confronted them with the inevitability of defeat. Morale, already strained, deteriorated further. Civilians in the Ardennes region bore the scars of occupation, combat, and destruction. Towns such as Bastogne were heavily damaged. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Winter conditions compounded the suffering, leaving populations vulnerable and displaced. The battle was not merely a military event. It was a human catastrophe unfolding across frozen landscapes. Political and military response. The road to victory. In the aftermath, Allied command consolidated its strategic advantage. The Western Allies resumed their advance toward Germany's borders with renewed determination. The lessons of the Ardennes, particularly regarding intelligence, preparedness, and logistical resilience, were integrated into subsequent operations. The cooperation between Allied nations, tested during the crisis, emerged stronger. While tensions persisted, particularly regarding command structures and strategic priorities, the shared experience of the battle reinforced unity at a critical moment. For Germany, the consequences were terminal. The failure of the Ardennes offensive eliminated any realistic possibility of negotiating from a position of strength. The Western Front was now irreversibly compromised. Combined with Soviet advances in the east, Germany faced encirclement and eventual collapse. Legacy and historical significance. The Battle of the Bulge stands as the last major German offensive operation of World War II, a final attempt to alter the course of an already lost conflict. Its significance operates on multiple levels. Militarily, it demonstrated that even a weakened force, under certain conditions, could achieve operational surprise and inflict serious disruption. The initial success of the German attack remains a case study in intelligence failure and the dangers of underestimating an adversary. Strategically, it marked the exhaustion of Germany's offensive capability in the West. After the Ardennes, German forces would fight defensively until the end of the war. Psychologically, the battle reinforced the resilience of Allied forces. The ability to absorb a major shock, reorganize, and counterattack effectively became a defining feature of the final phase of the war. Historically, the battle occupies a unique position. It is both a testament to the enduring lethality of modern industrial warfare and a reflection of the limits of strategic ambition divorced from material reality. The vision that drove the offensive, of a single, decisive blow restoring strategic balance, belonged to an earlier phase of the war. By late 1944, the conflict had evolved into a contest of resources, production, and endurance. In that context, the Ardennes offensive was not merely a failure of execution, it was a failure of strategic understanding. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the war in Western Europe reached its final moment of unpredictability. Afterward, the outcome would unfold with increasing inevitability. The bulge in the line would disappear, the front would stabilize, and then, with mounting pressure from both East and West, the Third Reich would collapse. But for those who stood in that winter, amid snow, smoke, and uncertainty, the outcome was anything but certain. It was decided hour by hour, road by road, and life by life.